Hey guys, looks like it's been almost 2 months since I did my last quickie reading video, so I guess I need to go back to the bread and butter of the old channel. I mean, it'd be wrong if I didn't stay up to quota, don't you think? Anyway, we're gonna be looking at the article of Chris and Oratory. Let's get right into this. Whenever Chris wants to make an argument regarding his opinions, one way he'll attempt to move people is through orating his reasoning onto them. Since Chris lacks some of the basic skills needed to make an effective speech, rarely ever plans out anything he makes, has serious communication problems, and never does his research, his speeches always turn out lackluster at best and horrifyingly naive at worst. This could be due to his autism, since communication effectiveness is often affected by it. Chris is a public speaker. Chris often struggles to speak in a coherent manner that can convincingly hold an argument. Some of the reasons are as follows. Inability to communicate properly. Chris has been known to sometimes have issues making his points clear. His heavy speech impediment, brought on by autism, makes him incredibly hard to understand at times. He also, unfortunately, often seems to space out or lose focus mid-sentence, and repeat a lot of his points when he can't think of anything to say. His orations often include adaptations from other people's or characters' speeches, since Chris seems to have a difficult time being creative or original, and so they often turn out somewhat disjointed and weak. He almost always seems to get it right whenever his speech involves rage or wanting someone to die, since all Chris can think about in those speeches is getting his goal accomplished as soon as possible. This indicates a very physically focused style of thinking, also possibly a symptom of his autism, that prevents him from communicating theoretical ideas easily. In many of his speeches, Chris also tends to use very fancy-sounding words to make himself look more intelligent than he actually is. Chris seems to think that by using obscure words, or by making up phrases composed of existing words and affixes, his speeches mean more than they actually do, and people will think he knows what he's talking about. Unfortunately, however, this often has the opposite effect, especially if Chris is using the word in the wrong way, as he is known to do. And if the person listening to the speech isn't already familiar with Chris's strange vocabulary, they'll be completely lost. Lack of self-awareness. Be the change you want to see in the world. A quote which Chris should have taken advice from. Despite wanting to change the world, Chris rarely seems to attempt to change himself, whether for good or bad. One of the most important aspects of a public speaker is their willingness to not only change the ways people think, but also to change themselves. Therefore, an effective speaker would always be aware of wherever their argument or reasoning falls flat. Instead, Chris, who often thinks and speaks with a somewhat inflated ego, never looks into his overall character. He tends to treat his good qualities with care and attention, and completely overlooks a majority of his bad ones. The only times he mentions his bad qualities is whenever he feels he needs the pity of people more fortunate than him to make himself feel useful. Because of this complete lack of self-awareness, it is very hard to actually follow any type of advice Chris will give, given his inexperience in these same things. Never doing research. In order to get their point across, a strong orator must know a lot about what they're trying to prove to their audience. This means doing extensive research on that given topic and evaluating their current stance on the topic whenever contradictory evidence comes to light. Chris, unfortunately, often neglects this part of the process due to bad habits. Because of how little research Chris does to make a point, and having lived a very sheltered childhood, Chris seems to base his points on many logical fallacies, childlike beliefs, his past experiences, and baseless assumptions. Even when he does do research, the arguments he makes will typically fail due to a misrepresenting or misinterpreting claims made in his sources. Whenever he does his research, his preferred source seems to be Wikipedia, which many people do not recommend as a secondary source, given how anyone can edit its articles. Even if Wikipedia itself was a credible source that could be used to make a strong argument, Chris will often cherry-pick whatever proves his point the best, ignoring all other points of the article. Habit of lying. Most importantly, for any public speaker, they need to be someone that can be trusted by the general public. Given how often Chris lies, it is difficult for his speeches to have credibility, and so lose a lot of their communicative power. The law of non-contradiction and liar's paradox give reasons to disbelieve someone who lies even once. Some examples of his lies, specifically those in his spoken presentations, are as follows. Chris said that Blanca Wise received the medallion and sent it back. This is of course a lie, since Chris had made a new medallion and the old one had been publicly destroyed. Chris has made occasional claims that he really doesn't hate homos, despite several instances of him showing otherwise. Whilst technically not lying, Chris's moving of the goalpost when it comes to Liquid Chris's credibility as a true and honest quick is incredibly damaging to Chris's image as an honest and credible person. This includes the SingStar Challenge. Chris went to great lengths to tell the fans that he would never show gore and violence in his comics. However, he breaks this statement by killing Evan in a very gory fashion in Sonichu number 10. He later insists in his first chat with Jackie that it was justified because Alec gored it up first. Episode 17, which was written long before Asperchu even began, ended with Rosachu stripping naked, clawing a man's head open, electrocuting him, and leaving him in a puddle of his own blood. Chris promised to remove himself from the internet only to return in less than 48 hours. Common traits of Chris's speech. Rage. Chris often has a very black and white view of people and evil, tending to view people as his enemies if he doesn't like them, even if the situation is vastly more complicated in nature. This, and his lack of tact when it comes to his stronger emotions, be they love or hate, unfortunately cause Chris to lash out at people with insults, death threats, and obscenities. This behavior has even gotten his CWCki YouTube channel taken down at one point. The extent of what Chris might say to his offenders is ultimately unpredictable. Sometimes Chris will only go off on a tangent about how much of a dirty troll his offenders are, and will rage, thinking that will work as an effective way of changing their minds about conducting the behavior that was angering him. Other times, Chris will absolutely despise a person's guts so much that when he orates about their dastardly deeds, he will want the person in question to either suffer or be wiped off the face of the earth entirely. Threats. Chris sometimes will threaten his audience in an attempt to get them to do something to better themselves, or that will in some way benefit him. In the video That Is My House, he demands all of the trolls delete everything they found out about Chris's house off the internet, and even goes as far as to threatening the law onto them. Also, during the Clyde Cash saga, Chris has made several attempts to blackmail Clyde in a series of videos where he's threatening Clyde to stop trolling him. In some of these other videos, Chris tries to make Clyde look like a pathetic weakling and makes himself look like a Herculean chick magnet, while he was threatening him to have a fight with him. Bias and one-sided arguments. Chris has certain behaviors that can be seen as very stubborn. His refusal to change himself or his beliefs are often a detriment to him. This means that regardless of what evidence you give him that suggests he's wrong, he'll always try to find some kind of information out of thin air or fallacious argument to further verify his beliefs. Whenever he gives a speech, oftentimes he doesn't ever think about why people might not agree with his opinions, or he won't think about the kind of people that might not benefit from his opinions. This seems to be a symptom of some level of narcissism, which he has developed over years of enabling by his parents. Logical fallacies. When majoring in computer-aided drafting and design, Chris never ended up taking any classes in rhetoric, so Chris oftentimes falls into logical fallacies in many of his rhetorical pieces. His arguments usually end up being very unsubstantial as a result, with no relevant evidence in many instances. The following examples illustrate the logical fallacies common to Chris's videos and speeches, and give examples of each. Chris may sometimes misguidedly rely on insults and ad hominem arguments to argue a point. This is where someone may say something such as accusing him of being a homosexual, and then Chris, instead of arguing against that point using reason, will insult the person's character. This, of course, is a fallacious method of argument and does not verify Chris's sexuality at all. For example, in the video Killed the Jack, Chris argues that 1. The homosexual ads are inappropriate for his website and should be replaced with something else. 2. Clyde Cash's billboards contain false information. 3. Chris is straight. However, the arguments he uses are: Jack makes Chris sick, Chris mocks Jack, Chris says Clyde is lazy, Chris appeals to an imaginary audience, saying he's not the only one sick of the ads. Chris says that Jack is a sniveling coward, Chris says Jack is poor, Chris slanders Clyde and attempts to deplatform him, and then flips the bird at Jack. Not a single valid point was made. Strawman arguments. If Chris is arguing against something airtight, he may choose to misrepresent the argument, and instead argue against a malformed, flawed version of that argument created in his mind. These were used a lot against the troll who intellectually challenged him the most, Alec Benson Leary, who wanted Chris to not use Evan Christopher George's Simon Jew character, which Chris had gender-bended into Simone LaRose Jew. It was very hard for Alec to keep his argument on track, as Chris was so frequently using Simon Chew as a strawman, saying, quote, "Evan can have his Simon Chew," when Alec was clearly talking about Simonla, which makes the Alec Benson Leary calls particularly hard to listen to, since Chris's incessant use of this fallacy was so annoying. Moving the goalpost. Chris has a habit of not thinking his demands through, or otherwise let his ego get in the way of reality. This will sometimes cause people to easily prove themselves correct by Chris's standard, thus winning the argument. However, in retaliation, Chris will, instead of admitting defeat, redefine the specifications and requirements of evidence, which makes the process of being proven wrong an endless cycle of being presented with evidence and demanding more. This allows Chris to believe that any of his misguided delusions are true without allowing evidence to prove otherwise. A fantastic example of Chris's employment of this fallacy was in the Liquid Chris saga. Chris would set goals for Liquid to reach in order to prove that he's the true and honest creator of Sonichu. And even though Liquid continually achieved these and proved that he was the true and honest creator of Sonichu, Chris would never afford him the credit he deserved. Instead, Chris would say that the proof didn't matter because he said so, and in order for him to prove his legitimacy, he must fulfill this next goal. This is a very good example of moving the goalpost, especially since Liquid didn't actually create Sonichu in the first place. The only reason Liquid could so easily fulfill Chris's demands was because they weren't asking for actual relevant evidence, but instead were egotistical assertions that he was the only person who could speak Spanish, disproven in a video by Liquid where he shows a solid grasp of not only Spanish but numerous other languages, or could sing. It's an incredible example of this logical fallacy interacting with Chris's narcissism. Notable speeches from Chris. A series of commentaries on Chris's notable speeches, focusing specifically on Chris's ability to communicate, body language, and rhetoric. Weston Chandler's future message. Chris's future message speech is a solid example of Chris's early oral works, featuring a lot of the problems listed in this article, and Chris's somewhat problematic beliefs. It was filmed on his 25th birthday as a set of proverbs and imparted wisdoms that Chris had accumulated through his life, that he wanted to pass to future generations. Chris was very confident and proud of this speech, as can be noted by his intention to have it shown in local schools. However, he has never been approached by any kind of offer for it to be displayed anywhere. Yet.
And they may end up having a brighter future for themselves. Like, look at me now. I'm shooting this movie for a DVD. I hope will be shown in a couple of schools at least.
Communication issues. Chris is holding a piece of paper on which his script is written and relies heavily on it, often neglecting to look at the camera, causing the communication to not be as effective. A better public speaker would usually try to maintain eye contact with their audience to keep their attention and to seem personable, usually by either learning the script, knowing what they have to say and just improvising around that, placing or holding the script in a position where it can be glanced at without having to look away from the audience, or using more subtle note cards with pointers to remind them of what to say, making sure to maintain eye contact throughout. Throughout the video, the many pronunciation problems that Chris has are on full display, saying words like example as etsample and relaxing as relaxing, as well as generally slurred speech which is spoken too quickly to be effective. Chris also shows his regional dialect as well as his wit with the phrase, "I am here and y'all are there." Interestingly, the hand sign Chris uses to illustrate his oration when saying it is his 25th birthday is holding up 3 fingers. This makes the communication confusing, as a good public speaker is often sure to make what they go with their hands match up with what they're saying. Many of Chris's gestures throughout his output are meaningless on their own, only present to convey rhythm and emphasis. Chris's stuttering is also exemplified here, when he talks faster than his brain can think, which is easy for him to do since he has the tendency to speak fast like children usually do and doesn't have an easy time constructing sentences in his head. He says the wrong word and often goes back a few words to say the clause again to correct the mistake. An example of this being, "Today I intend to share some wise words." Chris caught himself saying the wrong word and so corrects himself. The amount he does this varies on how hard he finds the sentence to think of. Luckily, the script helps him know what to say if that happens, so it doesn't happen as much in this particular video. The parts where he stutters the most is where he goes off his script and makes a side comment, such as, "I haven't done anything I don't like doing either of them." Rhetorical problems. Chris uses a litany of rhetorical devices to put across his points, such as calling cigarettes death sticks and saying that he would like to send all of the tobacco that exists to the moon on a rocket. Chris also takes a negative stance on alcohol, saying that it's a slow-acting poison. However, these arguments somewhat fall flat when he uses himself as an example of the benefits of not smoking or drinking. Fit as a fiddle. While Chris is indeed not dead or suffering liver problems, he isn't exactly a portrait of good health, being unfit and overweight at 25. The use of good examples is extremely important in rhetoric and public speaking in general. If Chris let go of his ego, he'd be better off citing straight-edge celebrities like Billie Eilish or Tyler the Creator. Chris also speaks out against gender transitioning and intimate relations with the same gender. Unfortunately, this argument doesn't really have much to stand on, as Chris merely makes a somewhat feeble and lazy appeal to authority by invoking the name of Dr. Alfred Kinsey, a 1950s sex researcher. He also mentions the big man upstairs, presumably referring to the Christian God, which Chris believed in at the time since Christian marriage is between a man and a woman, and premarital sex is prohibited, making same-sex relations a sin in general. He also claims that homosexuality can really jeopardize the entire future of the world and the human race, which is completely untrue and baseless, since the LGBTQ+ people are in the minority and can still reproduce through surrogacy. None of these arguments are good or well supported enough to be taken seriously. Chris insists that women not be so picky when it comes to finding a partner. As well as this showing that Chris seeks to undermine female agency and self-esteem, it is also a transparent attempt to get women to have a relationship with him out of pity. This is an abuse of his platform as a public speaker and really undermines a lot of his points. Chris can improve his public speaking a lot by becoming more humble and respectful of other people's wishes, and unfortunately did not manage to provide good enough citations for his points. In conclusion, we can see from this example that both Chris's ability to communicate in rhetorical discourse is ultimately flawed, and would require a lot more speech therapy and communication training as well as rhetoric lessons to control. Autism tutorial. Chris's autism tutorial is a good example of Chris lecturing a large group of people on a widespread mental disorder, but without researching the subject correctly or using effective techniques in his points. It also displays rage responses and insult responses, so you can get a wide range of these techniques. In most of this video series, Chris neglects to actually talk about autism, its effects on one's cognitive functioning, how neurotypical should treat people on the autism spectrum, and seldom gives appropriate or recommended advice. When he isn't telling parents of autistic children to mainstream their kids and irrationally hating on a part of the spectrum, he is giving very incoherent and convoluted speeches. Here are just a few of his speeches he gives in the video series. Fellow autistic people, I encourage you to man and woman up respectively. Go out into the real world and make real friends with full, great quality friendships. Do it now! In this speech, Chris doesn't seem to account for people who are much lower on the spectrum and therefore can't socialize with others like he demands them to. He also doesn't seem to grasp the idea that all autistic people develop differently, hence why it's called a spectrum in the first place. Because of this, despite being somewhat incompetent at socializing himself, he thinks that if he just acts as a role model and tells autistic people to go out and just talk to people, their disorder will magically become manageable. I feel dislike towards you for selfishly putting your ill name in association with autism, and with a name like Asperger, I feel it only makes us autistic kind sound even worse. Asperger's. You should have left it as it was. Autism is autism, and in your research, you linked it up with psychopaths. I feel even more offended at that. Now get out of my sight. Due to his lack of research on Hans Asperger's contribution to the understanding of autism, him twisting and cherry-picking what he found out about Hans's research, and him failing to realize that Hans is autistic himself, Chris seems to view Hans as the culprit behind his and other autistics' lack of appreciation from anyone, simply for naming a condition after himself and having it sound like Asperger's in his juvenile mind. Also somewhat failing to realize that Asperger's is only part of the spectrum and not another name for it, and therefore takes offense at it for no real reason. No damn way, Imposter. This public message from Chris is aimed primarily at Liquid Chris, but is also a message to the wider public and companies who Chris seems to think could stop Liquid from selling merchandise, when it's unlikely they would even take his side. Chris employs a number of tendencies mentioned in this page throughout the video, but obviously none more prevalent than threats and blind hatred. Chris notably babbles and stutters a lot less when making this video than some of his more relaxed orations, but can have some serious problems when his mind wanders or has particular trouble with a sentence. A notable example of Chris having a stuttering problem is at the 46-second section, where an attempt to use staccato-like phrasing to get across his point powerfully, it seems to backfire as soon as he forgets which order the words were meant to be in.
Stop that brown stripe in the shirt with the paper medallion. Stop that imposter.
Chris throughout this video is very impassioned and aroused, and is neither subtle nor eloquent. His performance style involves a lot of hand-waving, raised voices, and lots of threats and insults. Chris makes his first threat of suing Liquid. This is assuming that he has the grounds to sue, and for that he would need more than the copyright registration of electronic files named Sonichu. Other than the very empty threat of legal issues, Chris also makes a very vague death threat in the form of "die, you," and also attempts to use black magic to put a curse on Liquid Chris. It should come as no surprise that merely yelling "you are the imposter" is not a valid argument, and is simply used as an intimidation tactic to get Liquid to voluntarily stop selling Sonichu merchandise. But Chris seems to believe that Liquid can and should go to jail for his actions. Although "die you" is technically a death threat, it's very unlikely that Chris will make an attempt on Liquid's life, and doesn't even seem to really be threatening to do so. Just telling him to die is a little too vague. Chris, in this oration, uses false equivalency liberally in his rhetoric, causing many confusing moments and points. The first being his copyright on Sonichu, which is not a trademark, is a grounds to sue Liquid. Admittedly, it is generally accepted that Chris is too naive to realize that he has no legal grounds to make such a threat, but it is a false equivalency nevertheless. The second false equivalency is that Chris having sent Nintendo a letter and given them over $5,000 means that Nintendo know who Chris is and will be willing to stop Liquid from selling Sonichu merchandise. The third false equivalency is that the true creator of Sonichu is the one with his address, his phone number, and his parents. This also counts as a circular argument, by the way, so it's a double logical fallacy. The fourth is somewhat similar to the second, but Chris also claims that the company of Nintendo had known of him his whole lifetime because he bought stuff from them. Chris even claims that Nintendo would kick Liquid out. The fifth false equivalency is that Liquid should have the police called on him by companies or his fan base and thrown in jail to rot, even though it is very unlikely that Liquid would ever make enough money to get life in jail by selling Sonichu merchandise. Activism. Being an opinionated and even confrontational person around the subjects that he is very passionate about, Chris has engaged in many campaigns on the many platforms that are available. Chris has been observed to conduct activism for a number of subjects, from local issues about saving McIntyre Park to international issues about Sonic's arm color. Chris is also proactive about protecting the things he loves, except Sonichu. Twitter campaigns. Twitter is one of the many public platforms that Chris uses as his soapbox to speak to the world. The 280 character limit can't stop Chris, as sometimes he'll make a thread which is a longer speech comprised of many linked tweets. These are used especially prevalently in his Twitter campaigns. In these, Chris will use his platform to deliver rhetorical pieces on certain issues he is rallying behind. These are mostly triggered by trolling, being blocked, or because someone hasn't followed his orders, no matter if it's an individual or a company. Hashtag harass Quick directly. On the 1st of August 2017, Chris made a post for National Girlfriend Day, where he gathered up all of the gal pals he had made on Twitter. In this particular post, he tagged Planet Dolan voice actress and artist Doopy Doover, whose internet post Chris replied to on a regular basis. Doopy, seeming unsettled by Chris's possible labeling of her as a gal pal and using the pet name Darling, made it clear to Chris that she is a stranger to him and that he should back off. Despite this obvious message, Chris took it as meaning that Doopy won't befriend Chris because of her influence with the trolls, rather than because of his somewhat antisocial behavior. Chris then came to the conclusion that Doopy wanted to stay away from him because his trolls were supposedly harassing her and the rest of the Planet Dolan crew. Chris, upset that the trolls were supposedly trolling his new friend, created the hashtag campaigns harass Quick directly and don't harass me the next day to direct all of the trolls that were trolling Doopy to him, and even made a video scolding the trolls for harassing other people for their enjoyment. Because of Doopy eventually blocking him, Chris retired the hashtag on the 4th of August 2017. With propaganda like that, how could the campaign fail? Hashtag block the trolls. On the 28th of August 2017, after being stressed out by his conversation with Lady of the Cosmo, Chris, thinking he was no way responsible for the bad things that happened to him, made a post regarding how the trolls have recently made him feel off. After making this post, he made a long-winded speech about how good would rule over the evil that is the trolls. He eventually followed the Twitter hashtag block the trolls. His arguments mostly consisted of false equivalencies. He compared himself to a hero defending the Twitter user he liked, attempting to invoke emotion by naming heroes like Sailor Moon and Optimus Prime. In reality, Chris was like a more affectionate and enthusiastic dog with fleas coming into someone's house, and getting very confused and angry when he was thrown out. Chris is confused about why he would be rejected, when the person could just comb all of the fleas out, but the fleas reproduce and get everywhere, and Chris simply isn't worth keeping. This gaping flaw in his argument causes the speech to fall flat, resulting in 80% of people voting in the poll he made that it was the correct choice just to block Chris, as it is easier. My Little Pony protest. On the 13th of August 2018, after Hasbro announced that their popular children's show My Little Pony would end their 4th generation TV show, Friendship is Magic, and proceed on to a 5th generation, Chris, believing that he had prophesied that there would be 5 more seasons of Friendship is Magic, started protesting against it. His rhetoric here is frankly awful. Not only is he appealing to authority, but he's also appealing to his own authority, as a CPU and an all-powerful goddess. However, Chris thought that this was a very good argument, and it would be if he actually was an all-powerful being, but unfortunately Hasbro is yet to respond to this protest. Some examples of poor rhetoric include, "I have seen a future that we must prevent, My Little Pony Generation 5. Nobody will take this level of reasoning seriously. I just did a reset to prevent that from happening." You aren't able to rewrite the canon of a TV show by saying something, and it is frankly ridiculous that Chris thinks that he should have this level of power in his fictional universe. CPU Blueheart commands it so as well, in agreement with Princess Celestia. Appeal to the authority of an OC and a character that Hasbro created, neither of whom exist. Reboots hurt the original very bad. Reboots stunt growth of the original. More baseless and factually incorrect information, note Chris uses the words hurt and growth here in the sense of affecting a living being, not just that reboots of shows make the originals worse. Chris often mentions that Equestria will be damaged or hurt, and he wants Generation 4 to continue for its safety. But it is a very poor veil hiding his true desire, to not have anything change about Equestria, since it undermines his delusional views about how C197 and fictional characters work. Facebook campaigns. Before Chris started using Twitter as his main platform, Chris used Facebook as his public platform in the months and years after he stopped making YouTube videos as much when Bob died. Chris, using this platform, started a few campaigns about the things he was concerned with at this time in his life, in the early Tomgirl stages. Sonic Boom protest. In late 2014, it was revealed that the latest iteration of Sonic, Sonic Boom, would depict Sonic as having blue arms, as opposed to the usual tan color, which was integral to Sonic's iconic design. Despite the non-canon nature of this game and series, Chris took serious issue with the nature of the redesign. Chris wrote letters and took physical action during his campaign, but also conducted a campaign on Facebook. In his speeches, Chris often uses capital letters to portray shouting. These parts are often where he is at his most rhetorically inept. For example, this is an example of why Chris says Sega should waste lots of money on a recall of the whole Sonic Boom franchise. Sonic's arms are not blue. They seriously cause sensory overloads in me. Chris calls for boycotts and mass calling campaigns among the masses to get Sega to recall the franchise, and if you're not sure whether or not Chris is calling for this and expects Sega to comply explicitly because he doesn't like it, this is what he recommends people say. The very sight of Sonic's blue arms makes our ally, Christian Weston Chandler of Ruckersville, Virginia, suffer from consistent sensory overloads. Upon seeing them, his brain immediately shuts down into a momentary to lengthy, depending on how long he's forced to displeasingly endure the horrific sight, state of mental paralysis. Yes, Chris thought and expected that everyone was angry about the color of Sonic's arms because specifically he didn't like it. It doesn't seem to matter to him whether other people like it or not, and this has an extremely negative effect on his rhetoric and his ability to communicate. This position of severe narcissism often alienates Chris's audiences in his speeches. This and Chris's tendency to issue death threats eventually caused him to be thrown out of his own Facebook group. After starting a new Facebook group, these alienating and polarizing speeches further caused Chris to be pushed back by those who agreed that Sonic's arms should stay tan, eventually calling the campaign a success when in the next Sonic game, his arms went back to tan, despite not being the goal of the campaign. Brassieres for males. In mid to late 2013, Chris created a Facebook page on which to campaign about making brassieres socially acceptable and encouraged for men to wear. Chris, while not really giving a very good reason for wanting to do so, does however show his best display of rhetoric throughout his campaigns, presumably due to the help of somebody else. His reasoning and thought processes are well set out and developed, thanks to the page's administrators who are helping Chris's arguments become more well put. For example, the original About page was very well considered and offered many convincing reasons that it should be socially acceptable, such as sports bras prevent chafing commonly experienced by joggers. Bras can provide support and relief for the wearer's chest and back. Some conditions cause males to develop larger breasts, which is often a cause of embarrassment. Bras designed for males, or sports bras in the appropriate size, can flatten or lessen the appearance of male breast and help the wearer feel more confident. Many males wear undershirts to accomplish this purpose, often with suboptimal results. Some males enjoy wearing brassieres as an expression of gender or sexual identity. Though this is a valid use, it is not the focus of this page. Anyone who wants to wear a bra for whatever reason should be free to do so. This very well thought out and thought-provoking set of reasons was almost certainly not said by Chris, but it is a good backdrop, on which to contrast the direction in which Chris takes the page once the administrators stop controlling him as much and Chris uses some of his fallacies and confusing diction. For instance, this quote, which is extremely bewildering. Ryan Gosling wears a man bra. Okay, maybe he doesn't, but we can't know for sure. Rather than appealing to people that social acceptance of men wearing bras is a good thing, he's merely asserting that it is socially acceptable already by appealing to authority, and then suggesting we can't know for sure means we should consider it as acceptable already. That's 3 fallacies in a very short passage. In late 2014, when the page was picked up by Chris after a long hiatus, Chris didn't have the administrators to help him at all, and so quickly devolved into something vastly different and didn't last very long, proving that the campaign was really over by this point. He came out as transsexual and told men that they should wear skirts as well as bras. These arguments weren't quite as well formulated. In the comic, for you are not just dragging Kristen Weston Chandler's name in the mud, you also drag the American hopes and dreams and ideas of the majority of these great, humble United States of America along with them. You've had your laughs, but ask yourself, is it really worth it to continue on with these slanders that drags the names of the good people within this country that was founded with love and peace within it? Those before us have fought valiantly to withhold that I was born and raised under the old glory that is the red, white, and blue. At some points in the comics, many of the characters will give a speech regarding their opinions on the current situation. Other times, Chris will use these same comics to write speeches of his own. The comics turn out to be a very good source for learning about Chris's orating skills. Chris often displays many of the rhetorical devices outlined in this page, favoring distortions of reality that suggest that people he doesn't like are worse than they really are, and that he is more virtuous than he actually is. He uses a lot of ad hominems, which merely serve to make Chris appear to be a more vindictive and egotistical character than he would like his readers to believe. For example, towards the end of episode 17 in Sonichu 8, Sonichu gives a speech about how Jason Kendrick Howell is not only triggering Chris by giving Rosachu a pickle, but how doing so somehow drags both his and other United States citizens through the mud, even though Rosachu is not a political figure. This is an example of Chris using false equivalence to put the point across that it is immoral and illegal to portray Rosachu in this way. Chris also uses a rhetorical question that uses heavy extrapolation to imply that disagreeing with him is a dishonor to the country. Chris is also using a false appeal to patriotism, because drawing art of a fictional character has no bearing on the United States, and his attempt to suggest it does is disingenuous. Chris will occasionally lose focus and go off on a quite drastic, jarring tangent by providing extensive exposition about something. This really ruins the flow of his speeches and makes his point less poignant and punchy. Ultimately, pacing suffers a lot in the speeches of Sonichu due to these errors. And unfortunately, I believe that's going to be the end of today's video. I learned a fair bit about Chris today, and I hope you did as well. If you like what I do, leave a comment, rate, and subscribe. If you want to support me in a more personal way, you can check out the Patreon link and the Teespring link in the description. I've got more content coming down the pipeline. But until then, I'll see you degenerates next time.